let's be honest, we've never had trust. From a Caribbean, African, global majority standpoint, we've never had trust in the police.
This is essentially a racialized experience for many people.
What does safety mean for our communities? Actually, what does that mean?
I was about to say the same thing. We're connected. Unpacked. Young People and Violence with me, Richie Brave. So welcome back. We've been unpacking youth violence in the past 2 episodes, not just as something that happens, but something that's environmental, something that's systemic, and something that, sits in pressure when it comes to young people. But today we're asking a question that sits right at the center of all of that. And that question is, when we say policing is about keeping young people safe, what does that actually mean? Because safety isn't this neutral idea. It's defined, it's reinforced, and it's experienced very differently depending on who you are. And that's why it was really important for me to bring these 3 guests to the table. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
You feeling comfortable? You feeling good?
Yeah, we're ready.
I'll try and, in the beginning, I'll try and get it a little bit. It feels a bit stiff. Just loosen up a little bit.
Relax the shoulders.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm going to introduce each of you. So in front of me, I've got Sophia Purdy-Moore. Now, your work at the Runnymede Trust challenges how we understand policing harm and the systems behind them. I think that's really important. I've got Sayce Holmes-Lewis. You're working directly with young people at Mentivity, seeing how these systems land in real life every day, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also the London Policing Board.
And the London Policing Board. Thank you,
forget
Sayce. I won't forget that. Very relevant to the conversation today.
Yeah.
And last but not least, of course, I've got JMF, content creator. You connected through Mentivity, right?
Yeah.
With Sayce. Okay, amazing. So thank you so much for joining me. I don't want to give away your age, but the young person on that. But thank you for being here, because your lived experience and the stuff on the ground is rooted in reality and not just theory. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes when we have these conversations around policing and community, it sits in the theory, but the theory doesn't always feel like it comes alive. The theory complements the lived experience, and lived experience complements the theory, right? They have to exist with each other. So I'm going to ask you an interesting first question. What were your first interactions with the police? I'm going to start with you, because I think often we ask men that question first. But as a woman, what was your first experience with the police like?
Well, mine was actually, speaking to that, it was as a teenager, I really noticed if I was hanging out with my white friends, we wouldn't even see police. And if we did, then they would completely pay us no mind. But if I'd be hanging out with my black friends, especially if there were boys in the group, we would immediately be, this is from around the age of 13, 14, stopped, searched. This is just the boys. I just remember just witnessing that, mostly in the summers as well, time and time again. And that just really showed me the racial disparities, but also the gendered dynamics of policing and of those interactions.
I can see you nodding along, Sayce. I mean, does that relate to what your experience was like? Does it raise something for you? What were your first interactions like?
Definitely. I think my first interaction was at age 14, a direct interaction with a police officer when I was assaulted by a police officer at Gypsy Hill train station on the way back from school. And I was always warned by my grandparents. They grew up Windrush era. They came here, helped rebuild the country, and their experience of policing wasn't great in terms of how they were treated. But they always warned me, but I wasn't prepared. And when it happened, it was just like a shock to the system. And being assaulted by a police officer was bad enough. But when we tried to press charges, it was dropped by the CPS.
And you said you were 14 at the time. Is that correct?
Year
you were
9.
a child, essentially.
I was a kid. Year 9, and then being assaulted, by the police officer in that moment. And then arrested and de-arrested and sent home. It was a real, it messed me up, and I didn't want to tell my mum. But when I got home, we said, all right, let's press charges. And as a naive 14-year-old, you're thinking, yeah, we're going to get this officer, punished, etc. And then, they took me to court for assaulting him, even though I was one assaulted. So it was a real wake-up call for me, and it showcased to me, the injustice around policing and how it can actually be manifested through those actions. And it was horrible. It was horrible.
So thank you for sharing that.
Nah, all good.
JMF, what about for you?
Yeah, so I feel like growing up as well, obviously in the end, you would obviously see a lot of guys as well, just getting searched. The police may be circling to try and see if they got anything, all these things here. But for me personally, what I've encountered is in fact, when was it again? It was probably, I would say, last year. Yeah, last year summer as well, fairly recently as well. I must have got stopped and I got put in handcuffs for something that I didn't even do. So imagine I'm literally cutting through Shoreditch now with one of my close brethren, and the police was saying that there's people that have been robbing phones in the area. So then I'm thinking, what has that got to do with me? So I'm just walking through, minding my own business with my friend and stuff like that. And then they come running down and then they say, okay, I got to stop you there for a sec. So I'm thinking, what for? They're saying there's been robberies going on right now and people's phones have been taken. So then without them even finding out who it is, because what I was wearing at the time actually fit the description, they're saying, right, we got to put you in handcuffs. And they put me in handcuffs for a good 15 to 20 minutes. And you know the ones there where it's like, because I know that I'm not guilty or anything, I'm just laughing. But it's like the way how they deal with people, rather than they actually investigate and actually know what's going on, they'd rather just target anyone that might look like a criminal or look like someone that they're trying to find.
Did it mirror your earlier experiences? So you as a child, what did you see around you?
Yes, like when I was growing up, I would see like a lot of people from where I live growing up, get stopped and searched maybe or arrested for other things. And it's like, there's ways to go about it.
I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because I think when we talk about first interactions with the police, right, I think our first go-to is what's happened to us and what we experience. But when we think about it from a community perspective, what we see happening inside our communities and happening around us. I think, for me, some of my first experiences was we had a local bobby called Tom. I remember him. He used to walk around. Everybody in the area knew him. So you felt quite safe with Tom. Tom was cool. But I also remember my uncle turning up at our front door covered in blood, and he'd been picked up by the police and they'd beat him to a pulp. He was really, really bloody. And this was when I was quite young, so I think I must have been about 6.
Did they ever give a reason why? They actually beat him up?
It was, back in that day, it happened a lot, and you didn't really need a reason back then. So stuff like that would happen a lot back in the day. So with the stop and searches and stuff, and the whole mugging stuff that happened back in the 80s and early 90s.
Would you say compared to back then, would you say the police brutality's calmed down now?
I don't know, what do you think?
Me? Because obviously I wasn't alive.
So hearing that, what's going on for you? When I'm explaining that story, what does it sound like for you?
For me right now, I would say I don't think it is at its peakest rate right now, but I know there's a lot of stuff that could be going on right now that I don't know about. So I can't really give a proper answer to that, but I do think that it's still quite bad to a certain degree.
And Sayce, I wanted to bring you in here because you said you work with the police.
London Policing Board. So
London Policing Board.
That was set up after the murder of Sarah Everard,
right?
Serving Met police officer. And
so you could answer, I guess, what JMF is saying.
In part. So the Baroness Casey review was that the police were institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. And out of that recommendation was to set up a London Policing Board of Londoners with lived experience, but those that went to hold the Met Police to account and support the Mayor Sadiq Khan in doing that. And I'm one of the 12 members and the youngest member on the London Policing Board. But just speaking to your experience, and that was routine for my grandparents and dad, uncles, friends.
Absolutely.
That was normal. And back then, you have the TSG now, the Territorial Support Group. Back then it was a Special Patrol Group, to the SPG, and they had the blue vans, so same blue vans, and they used to roll around the ends and just pick up black men and
just
beat them up.
Anyone that,
and they would literally, it was instilling fear in communities, and that was the routine experience of people that I knew. So when my grandparents and my uncles and aunties were telling me that, I kind of knew, but I never thought this would happen to me, because you think as a 14-year-old, that wouldn't happen to me. That's probably because they might have been in a place that they shouldn't have been in, or hang around with people, but you kind of justify it in your mind because you don't really understand the kind of insidious nature.
I can agree with you as well, because even sometimes in life, you've got this sort of common mindset when you're young. Oh, this will never happen to me. And then it actually hits you and you're thinking, I'm actually in the moment now where things are going left for me. Because even me, I used to think as well at certain points, I'll be all right, I can come through. And then you encounter certain situations that you would never see yourself being in. And then it's it happens.
Thank you for this, because I think it gives a bit of context for what I'm about to ask Sophia, right? So I want to read this. Runnymede recently published a report that you co-wrote, correct? And within that report, there's a big claim that's been made, and it's that policing isn't just about safety, but about maintaining social order. What does that actually mean in practice? Because I feel like we've got some examples here in what's been said so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, loads of things were pinging off in my brain while you're speaking. speaking about that, it feeling like a random encounter. But what we set out in our report is the historical context and the origins of policing. It was sort of created and developed in Britain's colonies in order to suppress particular communities, local communities, communities of colour, to maintain the unjust and unequal status quo and exploitation of the British Empire. Its practices were identifying the suspect community and then sort of, which is, I suppose, inculcated through political rhetoric and through the press, and then that surveillance of those communities, so through checkpoints, constant checking, stopping of local people who have been deemed suspect, and that collective punishment as well. So even if most people or no one has done anything, it's that racialized, violent punishment which we saw during the colonial times. And then sort of in post-World War II, when people from those colonies were invited to Britain to help rebuild it, those colonial logics also came home to the British mainland. And that's when we started to see really the establishment of policing that we know and recognise today.
So what you're saying, you're talking about colonial history, right? So this is, Britain going to colonise countries as a result of enslavement and colonisation. The Windrush generation came over here, people from the Commonwealth, India, Africa, etc., came into the country. Are you saying that some of the violence that existed there and how policing was set up during that time, there's been an extension into today's world, like current times, of that kind of rhetoric and behaviour that existed back then? Are you saying that is kind of embedded in that system?
It's exactly that.
Right.
So we had, at the same time, we had these migrants coming over from formerly colonised nations. In Britain, we saw this upswing in politicised rhetoric and media representation of particularly Black Caribbean younger men. And there was, mentioned mugging and this new sort of idea of mugging. It didn't exist prior to this. It's a category of crime. It's not a crime in itself. So that sort of created this fear and created this feeling for a need for these communities to be policed, to be over-policed, to be surveilled, which we saw. Then the 1980s uprisings against the sus laws, stopping, searching indiscriminately, predominantly Black people, and people across the UK, people of colour, rose up against this. And then we saw the sort of development of militarised policing, deployment of rubber bullets, CS gas, things like that. And again, moving forward to today, we see the like hyper surveillance of Black young people, also Muslim young people, who have been labelled as suspects, who are surveilled through the gangs matrix, through Prevent, and who are collectively punished through things such as joint enterprise. So we really see those colonial logics playing out today, which really tells us policing isn't about creating safety for our communities. It's really about that social control.
And just speaking to that, just in terms of Margaret Thatcher, I remember a video where she talks about the black mugger, and there's an image of that black person in the paper, and it's creating that fear element. And when you think about sus law, it actually started from the Vagrancy Act of 1824. So basically criminalising people of no fixed abode. That law was a precursor to sus law, and then sus law to Section 1 of PACE and stop and search as such. So these are colonial modes of thinking which are backed up by policy and just reframed in different ways. So when we had the uprisings in the 80s, in Brixton, for example, we had over 900 stop and searches in 3 days, predominantly Black youth. And then when you think about austerity, you think about all the different issues around education, lack of employment, this just became a melting pot of frustration, and it became a us versus them mentality in terms of the police and the local community. And when you have uprisings, they're mainly fueled by youth and the way that they're being, chastised by the system. It was a massive issue, but it's something that we've seen in terms of those touch points routinely over time.
I mean, you've spoken about your report. You've worked directly with the police, and you're able to speak to the historical context, both of you. What has police response been to this? Because the police would argue, we're just trying to keep people safe.
Of course, they're always going to say that.
Communities becoming more violent. So what's...
But then even that, when the police say they're trying to keep people safe, yeah, cool, that's the main factor. That's obviously mainly part of the job, innit? But then it comes to a certain time where the way how they're moving as a collective, not all police, because there's some, fair police that will deal with things in the right way and all these things. However, that can then damage the relationship between the police officer and the young person being stopped and searched, because they're just going forth of what they think is right and kind of abusing their power.
Let's be honest, we've never had trust. From a Caribbean, African, global majority standpoint, we've never had trust in the police. We've never had trust in these colonial entities which are designed to keep us down, and in the systemic pressures that we face day in, day out. Policing is just a big part of that, and how it continues to suppress us in different ways. But when police talk about stop and search, they always frame it as this is a prevention tool. This takes knives, bad people off the streets, etc. But what about the police in terms of, like you said, they're the ones out there, the purveyors of violence in our communities, because they're bringing that to the communities rather than building relationships.
Speaking of community, I've got a question, right? So I sat down with Sir Mark Rowley myself previously, right?
Yes, I remember that one.
So we've seen the report.
Yeah.
So, you know, you mentioned the report a bit earlier on that said the police are institutionally racist, homophobic, misogynistic, etc. So Mark Rowley and the police argue we're not institutionally racist. They refuse to use that language.
Yes.
So as a community, where do communities go from here? If it's been identified to exist in the policing system, but the policing system doesn't feel like they need to be accountable for it because they don't feel like it exists, where do communities go? Not to essentially police each other, but where do they go to move forward? I guess Runnymede are doing that work, right? I mean, Mentivity do it as well, but I'd be interested to hear from you first, Sophia. What do communities do next?
I mean, it's about thinking through not necessarily alternative ways, but thinking about what does safety mean for our communities actually? What does that mean? Does it mean punishment and enforcement? Or does it mean collective care, taking care of each other, making sure everyone's got the resources they need to exist and to thrive? So those answers exist already in communities. I mean, yeah, the work that Mentivity does, there's amazing organisations that we worked with as well to produce this research, such as Forefront, which was, you know, bore the brunt of horrific underfunding of essential services for our communities, but they provided political education for young people, as well as immediate emergency aftercare in cases of interpersonal violence, of interactions with the police for local young people. There's organisations in Manchester, such as Kids of Colour, which provide like really healing spaces for young people who are grieving their loved ones and community members, and provides educational spaces where they aren't policed, they aren't punished, but they're free to think critically and encouraged to do that. The answers, they do exist in our communities. It's about what gets the investment, what gets the airtime. And yeah, so I think this piece is really about sort of moving our thinking, our frame of thinking around safety.
I think what frustrates me, this is probably a personal question when I asked, well, is it personal? Yeah, there's an element of personal. There's frustration because people act like communities are just sitting down and not doing anything to make their communities better.
I was gonna make that point.
And actually, historically, there has always been things since I was young. Community support and like connecting directly with communities. Communities, there is an element of policing that happens. I remember, you know, when I was young and I had a few fights when I was a kid, everybody knew everyone. So I'd be taken round to that person's house with that person's parents and we'd sort it out. Communities have always had this approach. I did want to ask this question because I think, you know, JMF, you spoke to, you know, what you see as an abuse of power. And there's a line, Sophia, in this, I think it's important to speak about in the report. It says there's a line about policing being both a cause and a symptom of inequality. For people who maybe don't understand that, can you break it down? Because I think we've had some examples here.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially that means that policing is responding to existing inequality. And I mean, look, we've had over 10 years of austerity, the ripping up of the social contract of our social services, social provisions, youth services, mental health services, health service, you name it. People don't have access to that security that they once had. So inequality is rising. So policing is seen as the automatic response to those inequalities. So in cases of homelessness, when people are committing survival crimes, such as stealing some food they need to survive from a shop, things like that, young people hanging out in the street because they have nowhere else to go. So policing is responding to these inequalities, but it doesn't exist to make them better. It exists to control, manage, move on, as opposed to, you know, meeting it with care and resourcing and support that's needed to deal with these issues. And then in terms of it sort of producing inequalities as well. We know the impact that even police interactions has, the trauma that it causes, let alone being, for example, like labelled on the gangs matrix. We've heard cases of young people being evicted, them and their families being evicted from social housing, being excluded from school, having university offers withdrawn just because of they've been labelled on this.
They don't realise,
board, you know.
I feel like a lot of the police officers don't realise the knock-on effect that they have sometimes.
Absolutely.
No, but they do. They do.
They probably do, but
No,
they
they
choose to ignore
do.
it.
No, we have to stop romanticizing this in terms of what police understand in terms of the effects it has on communities, because many of them do. Because when they go in heavy-handed, whether it's TSG, they know the approach because this is designed. This is what they've learned. They've learned this from previous officers. They're reproducing that oppression, and they're doing it because they know that they want to have elements of fear. They want to be feared. They don't want to solve these problems. They're going in to really criminalise communities because they want to be seen to be doing something.
Sayce, I want to ask you, because some police officers would argue, I went into the police because I want to change my community. So I've seen these issues in my community, and the only way that I feel like I'm able to make those changes is to become part of the police system.
It depends on your approach and where you're positioning yourself within the policing structure. When we look at, you said austerity, so we look at safer neighbourhood teams. Again, a lot of great officers and people that are trying to do things from a healing perspective in terms of how do we build community with the community? How do we build relationships, which is important, but they're being underfunded. Schools officers, some of them are amazing, some of them are terrible, but there's some schools officers, like there's a man that I've been working with for nearly 15 years. This guy is respected, and he's an officer, and people know that he's there for them because he's built that relationship. But the minute you do great work in the police, in that area, you're moved on to another area of the police and policing structure. So that work doesn't continue. So there's no continuity. And then what we're doing is rebuilding relationships over and over again. But then a major incident happens over here in a hotspot in Peckham and Brixton. It just brings us back to square one. So we need to understand now, how do we police our own communities, but also from a London Policing Board perspective, I'm trying to bring that boardroom mentality to the community. So you understand that you have power in this structure by doing certain things. And we have to be strategic. So it's really important. So it's crucial that we're strategic and how we're sharing that information amongst our communities to really use this data to support us. If people don't complain, then we don't have the data.
Right.
And that's the thing. So we have to get people to think about, how do we complain? And we have to educate. That's the education piece in communities. How do we educate young people to do that? So it's crucial. So I think there's almost a sandwich approach from a board level perspective, where you have myself on the board and other members like Stuart Lawrence, Stephen Lawrence's brother, and then the community. We have to meet in the middle at some point. And how do they influence policy?
What we don't speak about a lot as well is the inequalities of people that were like in-prisoners that have changed their life around as well and have rehabilitated. Because obviously some officers now, remember, once you're in the system now, you're on the system, like they know who you are. You're now known to the police. So it's like, what I've even realised is that you have to give people not the benefit of the doubt, but their grace of changing. Because some people, they can come out of prison now, start up a new life, they're trying in life. However, that the whole police team might still have it in for them. A couple of the police workers that work for the police might be like, you know what, well, he's done some sort of stuff in the past, they're going to walk with that. So it's like, even though you might feel like, oh yeah, a police officer might want to join the team to actually, help the community. When sometimes, just like us as human beings, we can sometimes hold grudges as well. They might have a personal grudge.
You know what's really interesting about that?
Without doubt.
It's just true.
Yeah, I worked in
They're human as well.
rehabilitative services for about 15 years. And I can attest to many people moving through that system, turning their lives around and still being treated like they were involved in particular
it's like,
things.
you know what it is? It's like, look at it like this on this sort of scale. You know when you have some people in life that they will always see you as the old you. You can change and do better in your life, but they'll always see you at that sort of level. It's the same thing with them.
And more than that, it's the criminalization. Like, you're criminalized for life, and you come out into this world where we have no investment in or any sort of support for people who are in that position. They've been put in that position by the state, and then they're left to fend for themselves. They can't access the housing they need. They can't access the care they need, the mental health care they need. Evidence shows that investing in communities is far more effective in reducing harm than investing in policing and police powers. police on the streets. So there's a need there. There's like such a need for investment in our communities, for investment in social support.
And a reason why I ask that is I think people have this assumption, right? When you start talking about alternatives to policing, everyone goes, so you just want everyone to get killed. And actually, like, or you either believe in that style of politics or this style of politics. But what really interests me about what Runnymede does and why we're having the conversation and the conversations that we're having today, there's a real consideration around what people need inside their communities, I'm hearing. And they're saying, okay, well, this, policing exists. But a lot of the stuff that you're seeing is a result of a lot of the inequalities that are happening.
Look, the community has a lot of the solutions. The community has the expertise, they have the knowledge, and unfortunately, it's a very extractive process in terms of getting that knowledge from the community, put it into a fancy report, and then using that money to then invest in policing rather than invest in communities. So Mentivity works with the Violence Reduction Unit, London's Violence Reduction Unit, which is funded by the GLA and the Mayor's Office for Police and Crime. And we believe that violence is preventable if you invest, like Sophia said, at the earliest stage. Early intervention is key. If you think with young people now, a young person that might have special educational needs or disability, now if they're going through the school system, they're not engaging in school. Now they're criminalised almost by the school because now they're permanently excluded. There's a managed move, which is an elegant, exclusion. Now this young person's under pressure. Now they're out of education. Now they can be exploited. Child criminal exploitation. So we've now got to look at these things as there's issues, there's causes, and then what are the symptoms? Is policing part of that? No. Policing comes in at the end of the spectrum. So we have to look at where communities now are trying to solve issues around violence and violence prevention, because a lot of this stems from dysfunctional families who haven't got the support and the resources that they should have. So we have to look at the root cause of it. So the key thing for us now is that how do we communicate that from a community level into the boardroom and use that to influence policy to come back to communities so we get that investment. And that's why we have to have a community consultants collective whereby we have people trusted, we've got a lot of knowledge in the room, but where is this knowledge going? Is it where the decision makers are? Predominantly no. So we have to reframe what that looks like and stop recreating the cycle of harm. Because even us as community members, we can be complicit in that.
Do you know what I realised? I would say it's down to the people that work in schools. These teachers that have a lot of the education that are teaching the youth, they should really be using their knowledge and their skill as a way out to obviously then work on the youth. Like, cool, it's down to the police, but like, you lot are literally with the youth all the time, every week, 5 days a week. And then also what Sayce was saying was facts as well, because I look at it like this. I believe that every youth, every person like within the youth, like young person, should be trained up in terms of like self-defense team. And also what my grandma was even saying was so true. Time ago she was saying to me, she was like, you know what? You have to know your human rights. That's another thing, because that's why a lot of things are going to continue to keep on happening, because a lot of the youth don't know their rights.
Agreed.
It's like they're just going through now, and it's like when they then get tackled by police now, they don't even know what to do.
Schools have shocked me, actually. So I did some work in schools recently, and it surprises me how much the schooling system mirrors police.
Without
like, not police, prison.
I know you was ready to come in. I was ready to come in too.
Really,
So I sneezed and I was put in isolation.
Exactly,
So I was removed out of...
Low-level disruption.
Yeah.
I was removed out of classes for 24 hours for being seen as disruptive.
This is just really what my key concern is, and something I really want to help people understand is when we talk about policing, we're not just talking about policing that's done by the police. It's also really important to consider the police-like behaviours that are carried out and implemented by people who are in safeguarding positions, such as educators, such as youth workers. In the case of Child Q, a young student who was strip searched by police on her school grounds. It wasn't the police who stopped her. It was her teachers who have a responsibility to safeguard every pupil in their school. It was the teachers who brought the police onto school grounds. Experiences of education are, for particularly working class young people of colour, it's preparation for prison. So having a very disinteresting curriculum, limited time to freely express themselves, to even exercise, or to play, just to play.
There's a lack of empathy,
and then and then being put into seclusion, being excluded, being taken out of the school community. So already we're seeing this policing of young people from the very moment they enter the school system.
Policing is part of the wider system. Education makes up that Eurocentric system, which is
Absolutely.
centered in whiteness, which is centered in that whiteness is superior to others. And that's that colonial mode of thinking.
Does this affect working class white children? Because I see the news
does.
saying this a lot.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because we're saying Eurocentric whiteness. So
Yeah.
essentially what we're talking about is aristocracy, right?
Yes.
So,
upper
what's
class.
seen as
Yeah.
the upper class.
Yeah. So definitely. So you look at reports and studies around the colonial modes of thinking, and you can go back to the legacy of policing, Northern Ireland. That was really the testing ground for a lot of policing. Same as in India. This was the testing ground for a lot of police kind of approaches to violence and to suppressing communities. So now when we look at the legacy now of colonialism, we look at now the Caribbean, we look at the young black boys from Caribbean backgrounds in Southwark in particular, highest rates of exclusion, but also centered around that was also white Irish boys, so in the Republic of Ireland. So this is a legacy of oppression that is manifesting itself in communities, and that suppression now because young people don't know how to express themselves and not being supported in education.
So we're talking about the root, and the question that I wanted to ask was the impact.
Yeah.
What do you think the impact of this is on children?
Maybe, I don't know the actual percentage, but there's a certain vast majority of teachers that will tell some of the youth, you ain't going to make it in life, or you're going to end up here. How is that supposed to then encourage the youth to have faith? You're meant to instill greatness, even when you feel like, okay, yeah, that child is misbehaving or he's not understanding me. It takes time to work on that individual. Obviously, I understand. If you're a teacher, you're teaching a group of, 30 people in a class. You can't speak to everyone individually, but what you can do is install like that hope. Because what it does to you then, when a teacher then puts you down and says to you, you're going to end up like this, you're going to be this, it's like it really gets into your head now. And then
Policing.
Policing
Then
as
you
well.
get stopped and searched.
And then policing now, it's like, even with the whole gang stuff, they're not looking at how the young person got involved into this. They might have been groomed. Some people have came from broken homes.
Yeah.
Some people are really struggling and might not voice it. All these things is.
Listen, you hit the nail on the head. What we're seeing at Mentivity is that it's linked to now where you reside. So if you live on the Aylesbury estate, for example, you live on the North Peckham estate, your house now is infested with mice and rats, with cockroaches. Like, you got damp. Your mum and dad are working 40 plus hours a week. No one's at home to raise you. You now got to look after little brother, little sister, take them to school. Like, you're not actually having a childhood. And you talk about even play at school. Children are getting less than 30 minutes for lunch. Adults get an hour.
That's the
Adults get an hour.
That is so
what's going on here? Like, play is where you learn about boundaries. And young children now are not having childhoods. And that's one of the major issues. And when you factor in now austerity in youth clubs and lack of provisions for young people, this is why they congregate on the streets.
I've got a fact here because I think it underpins what you've all been saying. So the fact is, according to the 2025 Centre for Crime and Justice Studies report, being stopped by the police at a young age was associated with higher likelihood of violent offending. The same early contact was also linked to lower educational aspirations. Young people who had been stopped were significantly less likely to believe they would go to university. So we have a system that says it's protecting young people, but it might actually be reinforcing the very conditions, I think, that it's trying to prevent. So what actually works instead?
I mean, having spoken with communities and looked at different models that exist, not only in the UK, but globally, one thing's very clear, that meeting people's needs, that's what creates safety on a very basic level. So yes, investment in housing, healthcare, education, all these things. If we're talking about sort of justice and where harm does occur, we really think that investment in, well, first of all, harm prevention, but when harm does happen, restorative forms of justice, transformative forms of justice that take into account the systems in which we all exist, which don't seek to punish, but seek to repair and heal everyone who's involved. And that includes the wider community, because we're all impacted. When harm occurs in our communities, we're all impacted by that. Punishing one person does not solve that. We call for reparatory justice for these historical harms of slavery, of colonialism, which have created this unjust and unequal society, which means people of colour working class people of colour still exist at the bottom of the pile, still exist these harms in terms of economic, in terms of outcomes, in terms of being over-policed. So yeah, it's a whole sort of holistic approach, I think, that's needed, and there just isn't the political will, but it's possible and it's very necessary.
And the thing that keeps coming out to me based on what you said, this is racialized.
Yes.
So it's not something that can be looked over. Yes, this affects people from, working class backgrounds across the board.
Yeah.
This is essentially a racialized experience for many people.
Everyone talks about Glasgow, 2005, the violence reduction.
I hear it probably on a weekly basis.
Right, but again, it shows that it can work.
Yeah.
They looked at the root cause, the school exclusions, no exclusion policy. How do we now get there at the earlier stage? How do we invest at the earlier stage? And that was a precursor to other violence reduction units. But that's because it was in Glasgow. And that's because it was young people that looked like the status quo.
It's not monolithic, but, in Glasgow, it tends to be white working class
certainly a different community. So it's things like that, even that more public health approach, we need to do that carefully, because the Glasgow model, that's responding to a very specific community, a white working class community.
Yeah.
We can't then, which I think some policymakers feel compelled to do, is just sort of supplant that and then add that into sort of multiracial working class communities. It's not going to work like that, especially because of this history and present day context of racist policing.
How does the community stop the problem being racialized and weaponized when the approach needs to be racialized? Does my question make sense?
It makes total sense, because we have to, as communities, stop being reactive and being proactive. And like you said, we have to drive policy, not just in, think tanks, but also from the community. And how do we do that? It goes back to consultancy. You have white-led charities, white-led consultancies come into communities, mining, extractive data from young people, from communities, as I said, put it into a report, and they won't go and get £10 million now to do this work. And then give the community where they extracted that data £10,000 for short-term programs. Everything is short-term cycles to long-term issues. And that's one of the things that we have to now do as community organisations and leaders. How are we strategising against a system that's already strategised for our demise?
There's also something around the sort of like ring fencing of funding and what will and won't get funding. It's not possibly impactful organisations that will receive the funding. And if and when they do, it's, for 1-year projects, 10-year projects, that's still not sufficient. It's not aimed at that structural change that needs to happen. It's not aimed at, really putting down those roots and creating that infrastructure that's needed. I think it's just because of political expediency, quick turnaround of governments in our political system, it's really easy to just say, okay, we're just going to expand police powers, expand the number of police on the streets. We really, really need to think in a much more long-term, if we're talking about policy, a long-term systemic change. That's not going to come from things like being tough on crime. It wins elections, but it doesn't solve any issues. So there's something really difficult that we need to do, is like change that political frame of thinking in the long term. Okay, how can we support communities? How can we actually stamp out these issues which have been created by successive governments? That's a really difficult thing to bring about. But I think if there's enough political will amongst voters, for example, if we're talking about changing policy, if that's the national narrative, if it's really widely understood that we can't police our way out of these crises, I think that's a really important starting point.
We vote for these politicians, but how do we hold them to account? And that's one of the problems, is that we've got this cycle of voting for the same two parties, which haven't delivered on their promises routinely. So it gets to a point now, where do we say that we don't have faith, we have no confidence in the system? It's because we live in such a capitalistic society, which makes it difficult. But then there are people that have expertise, and how do we come together? If we had, 1 million people donate £1, we've got £1 million.
Right.
So again, it's around that collectivism. Like, how does everybody do a little so that we can do a lot more?
I feel like everyone says the word community, but community comes under unity.
Right.
And it's like, it's actually togetherness, because everyone can preach it, but no one's really walking with it, or you only get a few people. It's like, for example, it's like everyone can do their own thing, but in reality now, if you just keep on doing your own thing, you're going to only see the community fall.
But that's the system.
But like, some people have got this stigma, like parents of like, oh, well, it ain't my child.
I was about to say the same thing. I think we're connected.
Man. But then even, I want to ask a question, and this might even leave all of us thinking. Why do you think that a lot of schools have stopped funding for like youth programs? Like, for example, like I said to you, for example, with me, I had a youth program called Reach Out Project that came to my school. Mm-hmm. I'll never forget, towards the end of my school sort of life, they stopped funding. They stopped letting my youth program come to the school. Mm-hmm. And I never actually, to this day, I never actually understood why. Do you think there's an actual rule? Do you actually think there's an actual real reason behind it?
All the budgets for schools are set by central government. Like, in real terms, we've lost billions in education, billions in youth services. So these things where young people, unfortunately, seek to prosper, that's where the cuts happen first. Education, sports, music, arts, physical activities, like everything gets cut. So this comes from central government. And schools are now being run as academy chains, as businesses. There's no pastoral care.
I think the way that young people are seen by adults is a problem as well. So often young people are positioned as they're ignorant, they don't know anything, they're problematic, they are disruptive, they're this, they're that. And a lot of what I hear about young people from a lot of adults is really negative. Yeah. How are we expected to build community when young people are just positioned as the problem?
Yeah,
I feel like a lot of like adults, they're getting a bit lazy in certain ways. I'm not going to say all adults because I'll be lying, but there's a lot of adults where it's like some of them went through their own personal experiences and they look at it like, well, you know what? If I was once young, your age, and you know I've done this, so can you. I understand the sort of drive and motivation. We have to remember, it's different minds you're dealing with. What you might have gone through in the way how you lived your life is totally different to a young person's life. And it's a thing where, because of like how the young person might be at the time, they're not trying to work on the person. It's like it's became so normalized now that no one really cares nowadays.
I can't help myself. I'm like, what's going on here?
But every accusation by adults is also an admission of where they're at.
Yeah.
And that's one of the challenging things, is that there's no intergenerational dialogue anymore.
Absolutely.
We're not building community from a young age. Young people are left to their own devices.
Yes,
They've lost touch. They've lost touch with each
But that's what
other.
I'm trying to say is that this is a byproduct of laziness, but also a byproduct of leaving our children to be raised by the state. And if your child only educated at school, and you think they're going to make it in life, they're not. You know, we have to educate them outside of that.
Well, I've got a final, because we've touched on so much there. I've got a final question. And that's, what's one thing we need to stop doing and one thing we need to start doing? I think for me, it's not about me, but I kind of alluded to it, right? My thing is kind of loving on the children in our community, showing them love and not using them as like seeing them as outsiders. I like to know what the youths in my area are doing, and for them to know me. Tell me.
That comes from the media. There's an inherent fear of youth. Always has been.
And a
in this
hatred.
country.
Like, we have such an anti-young people, anti-child society. It's really horrible when we don't meet
Feral
young
youth,
people with care.
chavs,
And you learn so
labels.
much about them. And I think, JMF, you said something really important there. And you said that what young people are going through, it is a different landscape.
Trust me.
And actually, us as adults, this is not about my opinions, but we're here now. Us as adults need to understand that my generation, what the kids are going through now, I didn't grow up in the age of social media. The impact on what they're going through and what they're experiencing is different. And we'd be doing them a disservice if we don't learn about it. I just love the point.
And you know, like Sayce said as well, Sayce made a very powerful and important point earlier as well. He was saying that a lot of people are lost in terms of like, no one's actually gone and found the root cause of how they actually feel. And this is coming to my point right now. A lot of young people, they walk in fear.
Thank you. Sophia, what about for you?
I think definitely we must stop treating young people with suspicion, stop punishing them, stop criminalizing them, stop surveilling them. Just let them live, please.
That's it.
And then we need to start just meeting them with care and compassion, and just allowing them to grow up and be free, be healthy, be content, experience well-being, and have their needs met, essentially.
I think the greatest thing we can do is invest in young people. And I'm not talking about financially, I'm talking about time. Investing time in other people's children is seen as the most loving currency ever. And that's what's important. I remember all of my mentors, all the people that gave me their time, all those adults that invested time, gave me that advice. I remember them all. And we have to get back to that and understand that childhoods are meant to be lived. as children and not adultified by their own community and by the systems, by police. We have to stop adultifying our children and allow them to be children in that moment. And by allowing them to make mistakes, you know, within that child is important because unfortunately, as you said, society, we hold children to a much higher level of accountability than adults. You've got adults here stealing from the government and they're still walking around. Children now, they steal something from the shop and they're the world's biggest criminal.
Why are you doing that?
we got to find a balance, you know, and we have to find that balance and we have to build more empathy. And by building those relationships with young people, we will build more empathy because children will appeal to that empathetic kind of, you know, the intrinsic value that we have in terms of empathy. You know, they'll bring that out and we have to soften ourselves for our children.
A lot of the opportunities that we get as young people is something that money can't buy. Like money, people have this sort of image, and this is something that I know a lot of people my age and even younger have as well. Like, oh yeah, like it's all about money. Yeah, cool. But the real richness as well, before the money comes, is freedom. Being around good people, people that value you, people that want to see you win.
I think this is such a great way to wrap it up because it shows that this isn't about like, it's not as simple as enforcement, is it? It's about young people feeling seen. It's about them feeling valued. It's the conditions in which they live in. It's the relationships that they build with people. And it's also the ways in which they're targeted by statutory organisations and communities that have an impact on the way that they interact with each other and interact with the communities that they're in. I think for me, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Thank you, because I think there's so many things to think about. And I hope anyone listening to this will go away and reform and reshape the way that A, they think about young people, and B, they think about policing, and C, they feel about community approaches. I think we've all got a duty 100%. To do something different. I want to give a special thank you to all of my guests who've joined me today. Sayce Holmes-Lewis, JMF, and Sophia Purdy-Moore. Make sure you hit subscribe to catch the rest of the episodes if you've enjoyed what you've seen today. And this is a reduced listening podcast for the Runnymede Trust.